Yeah, thank you very much, David, for the invitation to this very nice event. I'm very happy to be here and to speak for such a huge audience. Wow, it's really nice. Yeah, as you see, the title of my lecture is Looking Through an Awry Lens, and it will maybe take me about, I don't know, maybe 50 minutes or something to explain what I mean by this title. Yeah, to look at art through the lens of theater. This is something which you don't have to tell twice to someone who is into theater studies. In fact, rethinking the history of 20th century art through the lens of theater, as Claire Bishop wishes for in her introduction to artificial health, can be termed one of the main projects of contemporary theater studies, at least since the 1990s. At this time, the concept of performance entered the humanities and the social sciences in general. And as regards theater studies, influential scholars like Erika Fischer-Lichte started to center their attention on what was called the performative turns of the 20th century, claiming at the same time the leading position of their discipline with regard to the respective development's exploration. In the arts, the most important impulses of these performative turns were and are still seen in both the historic avant-gardes and particularly in the neo-avant-gardes of the 1960s and 1970s, which also Bishop refers to as precedential to what she calls the social turn in art in the 90s and the noughties. But not only art in particular, also culture in general was described as shifting from manifesting itself in texts and artifacts to rather performative ways of actualization. So when Bishop states that theater and performance are crucial to many of the case studies she refers to in Artificial Health, since, I quote, participatory engagement tends to be expressed most forcefully in the live encounter between embodied actors, end of quote, then most theater scholars would nod in agreement. In short, looking at art through the lens of theater is a matter of course for those who are into theater studies. But there's one problem, and on this problem I want to focus in the following, namely the problem that the concept of performance, on which the respective look at art through the lens of theater is usually based, is characterized by a certain anthropocentrism. Indeed, we know, and the information text of today's program points this also out, our usual experience is that theater and performance in general consist in an encounter of humans. That means human performance on the one hand and human spectators on the other, like you know. And this usual experience is also crucial for the common theoretical conception of performance, as the prevailing discourses of theater studies are emphatic on. Especially Erika Fischer-Lichte's conception of performance, as she proposed it in the context of her studies on the so-called aesthetics of the performative from the late 1990s onwards. The respective book, or the book which bears the title Aesthetics of the Performative, was published then in 2004, where she elaborated on this concept. Yeah, she puts the presence of the human being in the very center of this concept. More precisely, this concept defines performance on the very basis of this presence and of interhuman encounter, or as Fischer-Lichte puts it, on the corporal co-presence of performance and audience. According to her, what makes a performance, or rather, what makes a performance an event, and as such fundamentally different from artifacts like texts, pictures, sculptures, etc., is what she calls the autopoietic feedback loop of the reciprocal perceptions and reactions of performance and audience. So from her point of view, human presence and interhuman encounter are the indispensable preconditions of any performance. And furthermore, she also regards human presence as central for the basic aesthetic experience of performance, which she describes as follows, I quote and translate: "The performers always appear in their corporal existence. From each of their phenomenal bodies, a specific charisma emanates, which the other participants or spectators corporally perceive for their part. In many cases, a stream of energy seems to emanate from them, from the performers, which affects the spectators and energizes them for their part. The performer is experienced as present in a particular intense way. At the same time, The spectator who is struck by this stream of energy also experiences him or herself as present in a particular intense way, end of quote. To exude this particular intense presence, which Fischer-Lichter also calls the radical concept of presence, is according to her an exclusive capacity of the human body. Indeed, she also highlights that the emphasis on the presence of objects was a characteristic of an aesthetics of the performative. But as objects are, of course, not effectively responding to the audience, and therefore do not serve the emergence of an autopoietic feedback loop, she denies them the capacity to develop such a radical kind of presence as the human body. And hence, according to her definition, a theatrical situation which only featured objects in front of an audience would not be a performance. What did we just see before we saw the film? I wonder. But I will refer to this later. So, looking at art through a lens like this, and assuming that art has undergone a performative turn since the 1960s, the latest, thus implies that art puts the living human body in the center, and this, from my point of view, is problematic in several respects. Firstly, I would say that it is problematic in itself due to its anthropocentric perspective as such. Centrisms are always based on hierarchic thinking and on exclusions, and as regards anthropocentrism in particular, this means that the human being is kind of conceived as the pride of creation. The non-human is either regarded as inferior, as Fischer-Lichter's comparison of humans and things clearly exemplifies, or it is even conceived as irrelevant and therefore, in the worst case, simply ignored. This directly leads to the second reason why the anthropocentric concept of performance is problematic, because beyond being exclusive, hermetic, and anthroponarcissistic in itself, it also ignores what actually happens in contemporary performing arts. Already in the 1990s, but particularly in the noughties, there was a noticeable increase of examples in this area, which fundamentally challenged the common notion of performance. And I say increase because such examples can also be found earlier, and I will show this later. But as regards the 1990s, for example, the Norwegian group Barktruppen staged a performance for an audience consisting of cows in 1998. It was titled Quack. And what is interesting in our context is that it was not performed in an enclosed space, but in the great outdoors on a meadow in Norway, to be precise. And as you might know, a project of David titled Balthasar features a donkey as its protagonist. Of course, in these cases, we can still speak of an autopoietic feedback loop, and Fischer-Lichter would argue that they even confirm her point of view, particularly because she refers to the appearance of animals in performance herself. Indeed, she even pays a great deal of attention to this appearance, and she points out that especially in aesthetics of the performative makes use of animals in order to highlight the uncontrollable character of performance, which is due to its emergence as an event. Nevertheless, I would say that these appearances of animals also bring something else into play, something which exceeds the function of just intensifying an aspect which derives from the anthropocentric model of performance. And this one could call an aspect of non-human otherness, or maybe one can rather describe it as a kind of unhumanness in the sense of philosopher Slavoj Žižek. Žižek criticizes a new age attitude which narcissistically reduces the other, or the neighbor as he puts it, to our mere mirror image or tool which paves the way to self-realization and self-affirmation. And the point of his critique is the following: this attitude ignores the fact that, I quote, "An alien traumatic kernel forever persists in my neighbor. The neighbor remains an inert, impenetrable, enigmatic presence that hystericizes me," end of quote. This aspect, according to Žižek, is actually what fundamentally characterizes the human as such. But the reason why he calls it unhuman lies in the fact that it's exactly the aspect which the common concept of the human excludes, because it eludes the model of interhuman encounter on which this concept is based. Žižek mainly refers to Emmanuel Levinas' philosophy and his focus on the interhuman face-to-face encounter in this context. In front of this background, it actually suggests itself to apply Zizek's critique to Fischer-Lichte's concept of performance, because when she, for example, speaks of streams of energy circulating between performers and audience, she actually gets quite close to this kind of New Age attitude Zizek criticizes, and when she states that the experience of the other's presence leads to a particular experience of one's own, the other is indeed reduced to a kind of mirror image or tool which conduces to one's self-awareness and self-affirmation. As regards the presence of animals, it's of course possible to reduce it in a similar way. We all know that humans always tend to use animals as projection screens for their own images and that they try to discover traits of human behavior in them. But just as the presence of animals, according to Fischer-Lichte, might highlight the uncontrollable character of performance, it also makes the aspect which Zizek points out more obvious. That means it is less easy to sort of domesticate an animal's presence by discovering self-affirming similarities in it. Or more precisely, in view of an animal, it is less easy to overlook the fact that its presence always also remains that kind of reluctant presence which Zizek describes, a presence which includes a hystericizing absence, so to speak. Yeah, and a donkey, of course, is actually even a kind of allegory for this kind of reluctant presence. But looking at further examples from the 90s and noughties, one can even discover that the human body itself became staged in ways which emphasize this other quality of presence. And here I think, of course, particularly of performances like Gabriëlle Schleijpen's famous Self Unfinished from 1998, and also Mette Ingwertsen's Manual Focus from 2003. Yeah, and especially as regards Manual Focus, where the performers perform with their backs to the audience and with masks on the back of their heads. One can additionally see that, it additionally exemplifies an increasing play with means that hinder or interrupt or baffle the emergence of the so-called autopoietic feedback loop. And furthermore, other examples even challenged the common notion of performance on a more fundamental level. That means instead of living performers like humans or animals, they featured inanimate things, thereby not bothering about the minor degree of presence Fischer-Lichte ascribes to them, but rather focusing on their even higher degree of that inert, reluctant presence in Zizek's sense. So, for example, objects were set and seen more or less animated, like in Stift des Dinge by Heiner Goebbels from 2007. And of course, in David's project we just saw, performance Robert Morris Revisited, which premiered in 2009, right? But there were also other examples, like for example, matters and substances were set into motion, like in Evaporated Landscapes, also by Mette Ingwertsen, or acousmatic voices sounded on the stage without any present bodily source, like in the first part of another performance by David, namely this performance from 2004, or in the last part of Ivana Müller's While We Were Holding It Together from 2006. There were no performers anymore. Before there were performers, but in the last part they appeared and only their voices remained. So in short, these examples didn't only bring another aspect of presence into play, that means its unhuman aspect, so to speak, and they didn't just challenge the thesis that a performance only emerges due to an autopoietic feedback loop of the reciprocal perception and reactions between performers and audience. Furthermore, they even called the fundamental criterion of the respective definition into question. That means that they showed that performance can in fact occur without any co-presence of performers and audience. The observation of this development was the reason for me to write a book, and this book was published in 2009, and it's titled Postspektakuläres Theater, die Alterität der Aufführung und die Entgrenzung der Künste, which means in English post-spectacular theater, the alterity or otherness of performance and the crossover between the arts. This term, post-spectacular theater, refers to two other terms. Firstly, it refers to the term post-dramatic theater, which theater scholar Hans-Thies Lehmann had introduced in his homonymous book 10 years before, in 1999. And secondly, self-evidently, it refers to the term spectacle, as artist and social critic Guy Debord has coined it by his famous pamphlet La Société du Spectacle, The Society of the Spectacle, published in 1967. I felt like them this morning when I sat on the plane with my glasses on to watch the eclipse. Just a little anecdote. My reasons to refer to these terms were the following. Firstly, I argued that examples like those I just mentioned no longer first and foremost set themselves apart from an understanding of theater based on the dramatic text. Rather, as I already said, they do so with regard to a notion of theater, respectively performance, which is based on the criterion of interhuman encounter and on the primacy or ideal of immediate presence. Instead of confirming this notion, examples of what I call a post-spectacular theater fundamentally challenge it by playing with absence, with mediality, and the display of non-human or unhuman aspects. And this implies, secondly, that they also critically refer to and reflect on the current conditions of the spectacle due to the fact that these conditions have radically changed. That means they no longer consist in the alienating and passivating circulation of superficial images which Debord described in the 1960s. Against these conditions, of course, the neo-avant-gardes of the time tried to mobilize the audience by transforming passive spectators into active participants. Instead, the spectacle of today has incorporated exactly those strategies. Now it permanently demands participation and immediate presence. Or as Zizek puts it, I quote, "Today we seem effectively to be at the opposite point from the ideology of the 1960s. The mottos of spontaneity, creative self-expression, and so on are taken over by the system. In other words, the old logic of the system reproducing itself through repressing and rigidly channeling the subject's spontaneous impetuses is left behind. Non-alienated spontaneity, self-expression, self-realization, they all directly serve the system," end of quote. Hence, what Fischer-Lichte describes as an aesthetics of the performative, or as the English translation of her corresponding book is titled, The Transformative Power of Performance, nowadays exactly conforms the spectacle. The achievements of the so-called performative turn are not anti-spectacular anymore, since the spectacle has turned performative itself. Thus, when I say post-spectacular theater, what I mean is, of course, not a theater after the spectacle. Instead, as I already said, it's post-spectacular in the sense that it critically refers to and reflects on the spectacle's current conditions. And now I would like to introduce the two main theoretical consequences which I drew from my observation and description of this post-spectacular theater. Firstly, I described the relation between performers and audience in an alternative way. That means I objected to its common description as an immediate relationship of these two groups. What I did instead, also referring to Zizek's explications about the presence of the other, which I mentioned before, was to argue as follows. Due to the fact that performers and audience are never only present as self-affirming mirror images of the respective other, but also always as intransparent and unsettling counterparts, there has to be a third instance which mediates between them. Or in Zizek's words, I quote, "Beneath the neighbor as my mirror image, there always lurks the unfathomable abyss of radical otherness, of a monstrous thing that cannot be gentrified. In order to render our coexistence with a thing minimally bearable, the symbolic order qua third, the pacifying mediator, has to intervene," end of quote. The symbolic order as kind of the rules or the codes of social, of intersubjective encounter of social life. So in short, in contrast to the assumption of a specific immediacy of the relation between performers and audience, I described this relation as a triangular one, which always involves the reference to the symbolic order as a mediating third. Secondly, in addition to this consequence, I also propose an alternative concept of performance in general, and this concept I based on another one, namely on Michel Foucault's concept of le dispositif, or as is usually translated into English, the apparatus. Foucault defines this term as follows, I quote, "What I'm trying to pick out with this term is firstly a thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions, in short, the said as much as the unsaid. Such are the elements of the apparatus. The apparatus itself is the system of relations that can be established between these elements," end of quote. Because of the time, I won't go into details here, but I would just like to say what the most important aspects are in this respect. Firstly, Foucault's concept makes it possible to think of the co-presence of performers and audience not as the central and indispensable precondition of performance. Rather, understood as an element of an apparatus, this co-presence becomes describable as only one among many elements, which only together and never alone make a situation a performance, and which furthermore do not necessarily have to be always actualized completely in order to do so. This secondly renders it possible to describe the crossover between the arts in a different way than in the sense of a performative turn, namely rather as a development in which different elements from formerly discrete apparatuses merge and thus form new apparatuses. And this implies thirdly that it opens up a different perspective on the relation and the interplay between different art forms, especially between performing arts and visual arts. In short, if looking at art through the lens of post-spectacular theater, things look quite different than from an anthropocentric point of view. And this I want to exemplify now with reference to the film we saw before, because I would say, as it suggests itself to apply Zizek's critique of a New Age attitude to the common notion of performance, Kiarostami's description of two ways of filmmaking appears suitable to me in order to explicate the difference between the two possibilities to look at art through the lens of theater. Thereby, in the first instance, Kiarostami's film as such is of course a predestinated example of a work which shifts its focus to the non-human in the context of an art form which usually also puts the human in the center. And if it can be called a post-dramatic film maybe, especially since Kiarostami himself in the making of We Saw points out that he doesn't believe in the literary narrative in cinema. It can maybe even be called a post-spectacular film with regard to the fact that it doesn't exclusively feature humans but also and particularly non-humans. Of course in the whole film there are also parts where you see humans, but I think you see in one sequence you see only ducks. In another sequence, I think you see only the shore. But so it's not only non-humans, but mostly non-humans. But what I want to focus, as I said, is Kiarostami's description of the two possible ways of filmmaking, and especially his exemplification of this difference by referring to chess and backgammon. And here my point is the following. While Kiarostami's reference to chess can be applied to the common anthropocentric way to look at art through the lens of theater, his reference to backgammon, I think, suits the description of a respective look at art through a post-spectacular lens. Of course, a supporter of the common concept of performance would immediately object here, arguing that the common definition of performance not at all corresponds to the characteristics of chess. On the contrary, he or she would claim that in fact backgammon was the adequate object of comparison due to the fact that its inclusion of chance corresponded to the uncontrollable character of performance as highlighted by the respective definition. Maybe that's indeed a point, but I would answer firstly that the uncontrollable character of performance, which its common definition describes, is still first and foremost deduced from aspects which are exclusively human. So even though it takes uncontrollable aspects into account, it still remains based on the rules and the logic of interhuman relations and of a binary reciprocity. That means it corresponds to chess insofar as it reduces the game of performance to human factors alone, excluding those factors which, according to Kiarostami's reference to backgammon, stem from beyond the human horizon, so to speak. And in addition to this, Kiarostami's description of chess can not only be applied to the common way of understanding performance, furthermore, it can also be applied to the function this understanding has on another level, namely on the level of academic funding and research politics. Since actually theater studies plays chess since their very beginning, competing against other disciplines of the humanities for, let's say, the allocation of research funds. And the conception of performance based on the encounter of performance and audience has always been the main strategic tool in this context. So when German theater scholar Max Herrmann tried to establish theater studies as an autonomous discipline about 100 years ago, he played chess against literary studies. And he succeeded in this game by carrying out a castling, so to speak. In German it's called Rochade, exchanging the king, that is the dramatic text, by his tower, which is the concept of performance based on interhuman encounter. So by defining a distinct object of research, different from the object of the research of literary studies, he managed to justify and to enforce the foundation of theater studies as a distinct discipline among the humanities. And as the term humanities implies an anthropocentric character in itself, it would be interesting to investigate the question as to whether the focus on interhuman encounter was a kind of a necessary evil in order to be accepted in this academic field, maybe. But what also has to be mentioned here is that Herrmann's concept of performance is not only the one to which Fischer-Lichte's theory design mainly traces back. Furthermore, it is also her application of this concept in terms of research politics, which kind of repeats Herrmann's move, this time competing against literary studies on the chessboard of cultural studies. So actually, Fischer-Lichte's claim that there's a performative turn both in art and in culture is actually driven by the strategy to claim now, because of this development, theater studies has a special relevance in the field of cultural studies in order to research on culture and so on. So if chess is characterized by the exclusion of non-human factors, that means factors beyond human strategy, logic, and calculation, then the similarity lies in the fact that the common concept of performance, particularly in its strategic application, also excludes all factors which could challenge its focus on the human and the respective claim of theater studies to spearhead the humanities. Compared to this, a practice of theater studies which rather corresponded to backgammon and to a look at art through a respective lens would imply to take exactly such non-human or unhuman aspects into account. And if backgammon includes such aspects in form of two small cubes called dice, as Kiarostami puts it, it makes sense here to refer to a performance which includes a similar object, or let's rather say, it makes particular sense here in this context and with the fact in mind that we just saw this performance to refer to a performance Robert Morris revisited by David, which in place of two little cubes called dice includes one single big cuboid. As I said, this is one of the examples for the increase of performances which challenge the common notion of performance in recent years. And furthermore, the fact that it is a reenactment of a work by Robert Morris from 1961 also exemplifies why I was pointing out that I only speak of an increase, due to the fact that there already have been examples of that kind before. But I have to admit that when I describe this example as post-spectacular, this might at first sight maybe seem to contradict the approach which the respective information text on David's website describes, because this text says the following, I quote, "What is it with the spectacular? To find out, one has to go back to a historic period in modern art that was seemingly defined by an unparalleled will to be anything but spectacular, the minimalism of the 1960s. Of course, doing little can be quite unspectacular, but doing very little is again most spectacular." And it was. So how is something unspectacular turning into something spectacular? Is it the thought, the speculation, or is it the sight, the spectacle, end of quote. So apparently this approach seems to differ from my application of the term post-spectacular theater, but in fact this difference disappears when taking into account the transformation of the spectacle since the 1960s. At this time, this deliberate, unspectacular performance by Morris might indeed have turned into something spectacular again, or more precisely, it might have been received as spectacular. And one answer to the questions posed by the infotext is maybe that this was due to the fact that it applied the division between stage and auditorium, while other minimalist works could be received as anti-spectacular due to the so-called involvement of the beholder in the spatial situation, which was in accordance to the anti-spectacular demands for audience participation. But nowadays, especially in form of its reenactment and in contrast to the common notion of performance, I would say that it's exactly this which in turn turns into something post-spectacular. And of course, it's particularly the absence of human performance which is crucial in this respect. Apropos turns, a very interesting point as regards Morris' performance is the fact that it is not received at all in the discourse about the so-called performative turn of the 1960s, even though its title should be reason enough to do so, of course. And this, I think, is symptomatic for the exclusive character of this discourse and the respective conception of performance. Okay, but now let's get back to backgammon. That means back to the application of Kiarostami's comparison to the different ways of looking at art through the lens of theater. If, in return to chess, backgammon was invented with two small cubes called dice, then we could say that the reenactment of performance was maybe sort of invented in return to the common notion of performance. Different from chess and different from a co-presence of performers and audience, it is not the reciprocal reaction of human counterparts that counts here. Instead, like backgammon players say, it's how the dice fall that counts. We can say with regard to performance, it's that the cuboid falls that counts. And even though the cuboid might remind of a human body due to its size, even though a human is indeed hidden in it and causes its fall, and even though the reenactment is, I quote the infotext again, a spectacle and a speculation telling the true story of how the American artist Robert Morris injured his head in 1961. Despite all these references to the human involvement in this staging, we saw a performance that occurs neither due to an automatic feedback loop nor due to a co-presence of performers and audience. And I would also say that the cuboid's presence does not lag behind human presence in like trying to mirror the audience's presence in Fischer-Lichter's sense. Rather, from my point of view, it really gains this kind of unhuman, reluctant, and literally intransparent presence which Zizek describes. So perhaps performance can also be regarded as an example which shows that one should not only look at art through the lens of theater, but also at theater through the lens of art. But since here the task is the former, performance shows for sure that the respective lens should not be curved by an understanding of theater which is based on the common notion of performance. And now to exemplify how art can look through a post-spectacular lens, I will refer to the 1-minute sculptures by Erwin Wurm, which he started to create in the late 1990s and which were recently exhibited last year in Frankfurt at the Städel Museum from May to July. When entering an exhibition of these 1-minute sculptures, one discovers the following. Pedestals, or rather little platforms, painted white in most cases with different objects on top of them. So there are, for example, things like, you see them here, detergent bottles or briefcases or candles, pens, fruits, tennis balls, chairs or milk cartons. every kind of stuff. And in addition to these objects, there are also little pictures and texts which are drawn, respectively written onto the platforms, giving instructions what shall be done with the objects. Or more precisely, they give the instruction that the beholder, him or herself, shall do what they describe. And while the general title 1 minute sculptures already implies that this shall be done for 1 minute each, the specific texts sometimes additionally explicate this time specification for their parts. And this looks, for example, like this. Be a shell for 1 minute. So in clear contrast to what is usually characteristic for the context of the museum, namely the prohibition to touch the artworks, the 1 minute sculptures apparently invite the beholder to do exactly the opposite, or rather, they actually invite the beholder to make them come into existence. And if the beholder does so, it looks like this, for example. So at first sight, the 1 minute sculptures are actually a prime example for the involvement of the beholder and for participatory art, and maybe also for a performative turn, I don't know. At least that's how they are usually received and described. So if you search for information about them, you will soon find descriptions which highlight the bodily involvement of the beholder, the experience of the object's materiality and physical consistency, and the contrast to classical artworks, which are not supposed to be touched, existing independently from human involvement. While the 1 minute sculptures, that's at least the common point of view, demanded a performance which realizes them. So you'll find many descriptions which are quite close to the description of a so-called aesthetics of the performative, or let's say descriptions which look at the 1 minute sculptures through a lens of theater, which is curved by the common notion of performance. In an exhibition catalogue from 2007, there's, for example, an article by Peter Reh, which represents this perspective very clearly. Reh not only argues that it was essential for the 1 minute sculptures that they, I quote and translate, solely come into existence due to the objects being set into action by the beholder, end of quote. He also describes their experience as such, which first and foremost consisted in a bodily, tactile, and haptic sensing of the objects. So, for example, he writes, translated quote, that the mushroom in the nose becomes an extension of the body, which pushes against the alienasals and thereby enables their experience by making them palpable, end of quote. Apparently, both the claim that a human performer was essential and the emphasis on the experience of one's own bodily existence is quite close to what Fischer-Lichte describes as characteristics of an aesthetics of the performative. And like she sort of reduces the spectator's counterpart, be it a human, an animal, or an object, to a mere tool for the former's self-affirmation, Reh in fact reduces the objects of the 1 minute sculptures to such kinds of self-affirming tools as well. But now let's look at the 1 minute sculptures through another lens, that means through a post-spectacular lens, as I said, since then they look quite different, and we can discover aspects which a lens of theater curved by an aesthetics of the performative, actually blends out. So actually, it's quite evident that a beholder experiences a 1 minute sculpture already before he or she starts to execute its instructions. Of course, it's simply necessary to perceive these instructions, and what should cause us to say that this is not part of the experience of the work. So the aesthetic experience is already in process while the beholder is still considering whether he or she shall execute the instructions or not. And furthermore, if the beholder decides not to execute the instructions, the aesthetic experience goes, of course, on, nevertheless. So even if the instructions are only read, and even if the objects and the drawings are only beheld and contemplated, one self-evidently experiences the work. So as regards Peter Reh's thesis, it doesn't need much to put it into question. And while he finds his thesis confirmed by Wurm himself, referring to his statement, translated quote, if there's nobody to be found, the sculpture can't be experienced, end of quote, other statements by Wurm put this into perspective. So in an online video, that gives information about last year's exhibition in Frankfurt, for example. Wurm states, I quote the video subtitle, "The work doesn't always have to be acted out. Sometimes it's sufficient to just take a look at it, read the description, and then think about how you could play it out yourself. That in itself is already an active and interesting process," end of quote. Indeed, in case of many one-minute sculptures, this actually seems to be even implied by the descriptions themselves, since often they are characterized by a certain irony and absurdity, which sometimes even indicates that it's anyway impossible to use the objects and to act the work out according to its instructions. In these cases, it becomes particularly clear that the one-minute sculptures not just confirm an aesthetics of the performative, and the objects turn out to be not merely the tools for the self-affirmation of a human being that rubs its body against them. Rather, they prove to be always somehow reluctant to cooperate with a human who tries to use and manipulate them. Sorry. So hence, they indeed gain that kind of intransparent, inert presence in Zizek's sense. Instead of appearing as tools functioning smoothly in service of human self-affirmation, they confront the beholder, like backgammon does, with factors that lie beyond the human horizon. And yeah, in this sense, the one-minute sculptures show that there are always non-human or unhuman factors which can never be accessed immediately, but which always call for the intervention of a mediating third instance. In a way, this instance kind of manifests itself in form of the instructive drawings and texts, which apparently invite for human participation, or rather prescribe it, but at the same time challenge the assumption that this participation could ever catch up with the non-human factors and domesticate the unhuman presence which confronts it. In short, the one-minute sculptures show that there are always aspects we can only speculate about, and from my point of view, they also show that such speculations can be even more interesting than the spectacle of participation. I guess the performance of Mette Ingwertsen, which follows later in today's program, will tell us more about these speculations. And yeah, the reference to her work also enables me to lead over now to André Lepecky's lecture on darkness, which follows now, since when Mette Ingwertsen asked herself in a self-interview from 2003 whether she had, I quote, any idea about how to create the asignifying body, end of quote, she answered, quote again, "We just turn off the light, I guess. Of course, it is totally impossible, but maybe the darkness is something to play with," end of quote. End of lecture. End of lecture. Thank you very much.